Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's lecture. My name is Scott Allen, curator of paintings here at the Getty, and it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Paris Spies-Gans, and indeed to welcome her back to the Getty. Paris's relationship with the institution actually goes back some 15 years. In 2010, after completing her AB in History and Literature at Harvard and her MA in Art History at the Courtauld Institute, she joined the Getty Research Institute as a research assistant, working with prints and drawings curator Louis Marquesano on several important exhibition and publication projects, including the memorable A Kingdom of Images, French prints from the age of Louis XIV. She eventually resumed her graduate studies, leaving for Princeton to pursue a PhD in history. But then in 2015, she was back at the Getty Research Institute, this time as a pre-doctoral fellow. This is when I first learned of her groundbreaking research on women artists in the late 18th and early 19th century Europe. She completed her PhD in 2018, and her dissertation became the basis of her critically acclaimed and award-winning book, A Revolution on Canvas, The Rise of Women Artists in Britain and France, 1760 to 1830, published by Yale University Press in 2022. Based on rigorous archival research, sweeping statistical analysis, and detailed case studies, this book has productively challenged many of our entrenched assumptions about the constraints faced by women artists historically, constraints that were famously highlighted by Linda Nochlin in her pioneering feminist essay of 1971, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? While acknowledging those constraints, Paris's work makes a point of emphasizing women's agency in the art world, details the many careers they did in fact have, and examines the tumultuous historical conditions that helped make this possible. And Paris has been an effective agent in the art world herself. Not limiting herself to academia, she has collaborated on recent exhibition projects like Making Her Mark, A History of Women Artists in Europe, presented by the Baltimore Museum of Art and Art Gallery of Ontario in 2023-24. And she's also been playing an informal role in the art market as a consultant, advocating for the work of historic women artists and promoting its acquisition by collectors and by major museums. So when the Getty Museum acquired Sophie Frémier's Portrait of a Woman in 2024, Paris was quite naturally the first person I contacted to share the good news. She was also the person whom I simply had to invite to give a lecture. I'm grateful to her for giving us her time, particularly since she's been in great demand as a lecturer. Just a couple months ago, she was in London delivering the Anna Jameson Lecture at the National Gallery, and last year she was in Cambridge giving the annual Henry Zerner Lecture at Harvard, two prestigious gigs. And I think she's also been very busy with her latest book project, A Survey of Western Art, oriented around women artists. This book has the bold scope and ambition of Ernst Gombrich's classic, The Story of Art, which is why she's entitling it A New Story of Art. Be on the lookout for that one. I think it's going to be a big deal. Before we get started, just a few practical matters. For guests here in the auditorium, please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. For online attendees, closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on the Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. And time permitting, we should be able to take some questions at the end. For our online audience, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom menu bar. And for those here in person, there'll be mics available so everyone can hear the question. So raise your hand and a mic will come down to you. So with that, please join me in welcoming Paris Spies-Gans.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, and thank you all for being here. I'm so happy to be with you today. Of course, I was ecstatic when I heard the Getty had purchased Sophie Frémier's wonderful canvas. I was especially excited because, as Scott mentioned, I've long considered the Getty a second home. I volunteered in the education department in high school and college. I was a curatorial research assistant, and I spent a year of dissertation writing at the Research Institute. which all makes it particularly meaningful to be here in the context of the Getty's growing focus on collecting works by some of the very artists I study, women who were once so prominent but have been erased from our narratives in the centuries since they lived and thrived. I'll share my plan for this talk shortly, but to begin, I want us to go back to the year 1793 and gather in front of this incredible drawing exhibited at Europe's most important show, Paris's Louvre Salon. On a small piece of paper, measuring just over a foot tall and just under 16 inches wide, we see a woman, temporarily distracted as she sketches. Thanks to the artist's precise handling of white gouache, which is kind of a concentrated watercolor, it appears almost lit from within. The exhibition's catalog from that year tells us the name of the artist, Anne Garret, and the name of the piece, Portrait of an Artist Resting on a Portfolio. She exhibited 7 other works that year as well, none of which are known to survive. Barely known today, Garret, a student of Jacques-Louis David, had already been active in Paris's art circles for more than 2 decades. One of 85 works by women on display at the Louvre that year, the second open salon of the French Revolution, Garret's intricate drawing visualized ways that women were starting to conceive of and present their newly possible identities as professional artists in the revolutionary world. With chalk, ink, and wash, Garret portrayed a young woman at ease with artistic instruments. Perhaps a self-portrait, she sits casually on a chair, knees apart, her raised left leg comfortably, dexterously balancing a drawing portfolio. Unlike other artists in preceding years, whose fancier dress you can see here, Garret showed her subject in what might have actually been working clothing. Also unlike her predecessors, Garret showed her subject in the process of depicting an unclothed, winged man, hinting at her capacity to execute historical narrative scenes by announcing her ability to depict the human figure, even though art history has long told us that women were denied access to figure drawing lessons for nearly another century. At the following salon, Garret exhibited 3 paintings, another portrait, and 2 classical scenes. Both classical works were purchased before the show even opened by France's New Society of Arts. Anne Garret was far from alone in her prestigious pedigree, visual ambitions, or financial success. From 1760 to 1830, more than 1,300 women, including all of these, showed more than 7,000 works of art in one of London's and Paris's premier public exhibitions, an unprecedented surge in women's public artistic activity. These women engaged deeply with the cultural and political currents of their era, skillfully navigating institutional restrictions to forge professional careers. Today, I'll be talking about the ways these painters, sculptors, and draftswomen became artists in an era during which they were officially barred from Europe's main institutions for artistic education, an exclusion that I hope to show you has wrongly kept us from recognizing their stories. Because even with this barrier, women still found ways to become artists, and they did so in growing numbers. First, I'll discuss how one such group of women used exhibition opportunities to forge careers in the public eye in both London and Paris. This context will lead us to Sophie Fremiet. As you'll see, by the 1810s, when Fremiet set her sights on an artistic career, a system was fully in place by which women could aspire to the highest venues, patrons, and genres. I'll end by reflecting a bit on the complexities of reestablishing these artistic legacies. Our story begins in Britain. In 1760, hoping to monetize their craft, a group of artists hosted London's first commercial exhibition of contemporary art. This is its catalog. The female showing wasn't strong, only 2 out of 130 works, both conveniently on this opening, but it endured and strengthened with the founding of several art societies over the next decade. This culminated in the launch of London's Royal Academy of Arts in 1768, the institution that still exists today. The Academy initially aimed to promote an official British School of Art by establishing a rigorous training program, open only to men, and holding annual shows in which anyone could submit their work through a juried system. Here is a hand-colored etching of the 1787 show. The Academy enforced strict submission criteria to distance itself from London's other societies and seemingly to limit the frequency of women in its shows. Thus, as you see in the advertisement on the right, it banned copies, unframed, and craft-like works, here including, quote, needlework, artificial flowers, shell work, or anything of that kind. But rather than dissuading female artists, these restrictions arguably helped women establish a mainstream public presence, as the works they submitted by requisite had to look like works made by men. Over the course of the Academy's first 62 exhibitions, from 1769 to 1830, 606 named women and as many as 227 anonymous ladies exhibited 3,612 works of art. I've charted 4 annual trends: the total number of female exhibitors in orange, the number of new women exhibitors in red, the number of works by women in blue, and their percentage of entries in purple. On average, 35 women, 10 of them new, exhibited 58 pieces per year, or 7% of entries. Each of these works was evaluated and selected by an all-male selection committee. Now, 7% might seem small, but this means that women were more present in these shows than they are in most European and American museums today, where works by women were recently calculated to comprise less than 5% of all artworks currently on view. Already, by the late 1780s, when their numbers were still quite low compared to what would follow, several of these women were prominent enough to be caricatured in print. Here's my favorite: a hand-colored etching from 1789 targeting Anne Damer, a rare female sculptor whose aristocratic status enabled her to pursue that art at her leisure. From 1784 to 1813, Damer exhibited 32 works at the Academy, including this portrait bust. Within only 5 years of her debut, Damer's practice remained striking, or perhaps threatening enough to inspire this biting satire, in which she appears to castrate an oversized sculpted nude Apollo, the subject of a 10-foot statue she had been commissioned to make for the Drury Lane Theatre. The image targets not only Damer's sex, but the sexual implications of her artistic practice, with its perceived threat to prevailing norms of masculinity. Notably, women's participation at the Academy's annual exhibition soon rose even more rapidly during the French Revolutionary Wars, which is highlighted here. From 1791 to 1800, 117 women displayed their art on the Academy's walls who had never exhibited there before. A larger number of visitors saw these works as well, attendance soaring to just under 60,000 in 1800. By 1801, women's public presence as artists had permanently changed. Albeit a minority population, women quickly became accepted, fluid members of London's art world. They lobbied for their work's acceptance and placement. They envisioned paintings with an eye to print. A technique in print called stipple engraving was developed to replicate the tenor of a painter named Angelica Kauffman's ethereal scenes. By 1805, with the founding of the British Institution for Promoting the Fine Arts, women were practicing painting and drawing alongside men, as seen in this watercolor. Despite its caricaturesque quality, this image portrays women as a natural, assimilated part of the exhibition and educational space. All but one of the women you see here, who are actually named in a related print, exhibited at both the British Institution and the Royal Academy. So we have a cultural world in which women are increasingly normalized players. What about the other side of the channel? Paris's own Royal Academy had a deeper history, but it too saw a parallel transformation. While women were never barred, from its founding in 1648 through 1791, it elected only 15 female members and more than 450 men. It held its Salon exhibition semi-annually from 1737, seen here in 1789. But unlike Britain, only elected academicians could exhibit. So in the second half of the 18th century, women exhibited in small numbers at the Louvre and a few other Parisian venues. Then, in August 1791, amid the chaos of the early French Revolution, a radical decree allowed all artists, regardless of their sex, to exhibit at the state-sponsored Salon. In the 20 shows from 1791 to 1827, 344 women submitted 2,290 works of art. On average, they contributed 12% of entries, 2 to 3 times their presence today, with about 53 women, 17 of them new, exhibiting 114 pieces per year. In the first decade, 102 women exhibited. From 1802 to 14, years that are often characterized by the reversal of many rights given to women early in the Revolution, women contributed up to 16% of all works. Over this period, every entry was evaluated by an all-male jury, and the number of rejected works by artists of both sexes actually grew in these years. But entries by women maintained their overall proportional presence and grew in number. In other words, given the opportunity, juries weren't weeding out women artists. Moreover, from the beginning, the majority of female exhibitors listed their names and addresses in each exhibition's catalog, an act of deliberate self-promotion that I consider to be a statement of professional intent, because they were inviting potential patrons to visit their homes or studios to purchase, commission, or view additional works. On the right, we see these addresses in London as well. How did women forge and sustain this regular presence? Contrary to common perception, women mainly submitted highly marketable canvases with the most traditionally prestigious subject matter. In London, the majority of women's 3,600 entries were portraits, landscapes, and narrative works. By narrative, I mean a work that tells a story. This can be historical, classical, literary, or religious, or otherwise. Portraiture gradually dominated, as you see in blue on the lower graph, and this speaks to the commercial nature of these women's ambitions. Importantly, they exhibited in most genres in roughly the same proportions as their British male peers. This suggests that their visual choices didn't necessarily reflect collective or transnational gender prescriptions. In Paris, portrait and narrative works dominated women's entries. This only partially echoed broader trends. Compared to all exhibitors, women showed about 10% more portraits, similar proportions of narrative scenes, and significantly fewer landscapes. Still lifes comprised only 5% of women's entries. Long-standing associations of women with still lifes, including flower paintings, seem to owe partially to a few artists who achieved considerable prestige in the field, and partially to gendered critical discourse, moments when critics urged women to stick to flowers instead of the narrative and portrait canvases they were actually exhibiting. The numbers show that gendered rhetoric did not always map onto practice. Perhaps consciously combating such stereotypes, many women used their new freedom to exhibit to visually define the terms on which the public saw them as artists. In the first decade of the Open Salon, they exhibited at least 39 depictions of female artists, either self-portraits, portraits of peers, or images of women engaged in artistic activity, including these. I don't think it's a coincidence that these were also the years in which new concepts of political citizenship were taking shape and being gendered male. These artists implicitly shifted the discourse on their own abilities and practice. Sometimes they tackle these tensions explicitly. Here's another work exhibited in 1793, the Second Salon of the Revolution, by Marie-Nicole Dumont. It's titled The Author at Her Occupations. With a palette in one hand, Dumont turns away from the portrait she paints, showing either her father or husband, who were both artists, as she attends to her baby, lifting up the cover of a bassinet as the child's arms reach out to her. We see artist portfolios on the floor, a framed canvas on a chair, and a piano and bookshelves in the recesses of the room. Dumont is literally visualizing a balancing act as she turns between her roles as wife, mother, citizen, and artist, all of which were being redefined at this very moment. In fact, even while the revolutionary state began to legislate and limit women's public activity, neither works by women nor their growing presence on the Louvre's walls seem to have awoken strong critical objections until the end of the decade. When concerns emerged in 1799, amid women's rising exhibiting numbers, they aired old tropes: the conflict of public activity with domestic responsibilities, and a contrived perception of these artists' desire for glory. But despite anxieties about public presence, etched views of the 1801 Salon show several works by female artists prominently hung, including 2 images of artists at work on the main wall. The third that you see on your right appeared elsewhere. These paintings suggest a calcifying visual language for depicting the female painter as an artistic subject. By 1801, as in London, women occupied an accepted place in Paris's annual show, and images of female artists at work had even become prescriptive. So who were these women, and how did they become artists? On the left, you see a self-portrait by the Bristol-based painter Rolinda Sharples, featuring her mother and teacher Ellen Sharples. On the right, you see a more traditional studio scene by Marie-Gabrielle Capet, in which she celebrates her teacher Adelaide Labille-Guiard and their shared lineage. Above Labille-Guiard stands François Vincent, her teacher, and later husband. She paints a portrait of his teacher. As these 2 canvases exemplify, British women trained more often in home-based environments, as did their male peers, while French women navigated the traditional, formal studio system with a considerable degree of success. An incredibly common assumption about women artists is that they were almost necessarily the daughters or wives of male artists. I found educational context for about 300 of the artists who exhibited in London and about 250 who exhibited in Paris. On the British side, nearly 3/4 did come from artistic families, while less than 1/5 established relationships with male mentors. In France, however, only 1/5 of women hailed from artistic families, while nearly 3/4 worked with a male instructor, and 1/7 with a female artist. In both nations, less than 1/5 were connected to the art world through marriage. This means that women became artists by paving a socially gendered but professionally open path, each again reflecting their own nation's distinctive artistic cultures, rather than mirroring the experiences of their female peers across the channel. Of course, owing to reasons of race, class, or parental temperament, many women couldn't even begin embarking on this path. But those who did faced few prohibitive barriers in acquiring their initial training. I want to unpack this a bit. And again, I'll start with Britain. As I said, the majority of London's women exhibitors were the daughters, sisters, or nieces of men and women who also practiced art. This was not demeaning, nor was it an impediment. Rather, it was also the most common background for male artists in Britain, and there was immense professionality in such training. Numerous artist families consciously cultivated women's intellectual and commercial ambitions. This included 2 of London's most prominent early exhibitors, Mary Moser and Angelica Kauffman, famously depicted here as unable to participate in the figure drawing classes for which all founding male academicians have ostensibly assembled. A double-edged acknowledgement that they were part of this group, but their sex prevented them from drawing from the nude. Figure drawing was considered a key element of artist education because it supposedly gave them the tools to create large-scale canvases showing scenes from history and literature. Called history paintings for short, they were considered the most exalted form of art. Art historians have generally thought women didn't create history paintings because they lacked access to this essential aspect of training. Moser and Kauffman were both encouraged in their aspirations by their artist fathers from a young age, and both exhibited history paintings, and both, it seems, learned to draw the human figure, despite their relegation in that painting. An undated drawing by Moser presents a nude woman, seemingly from life and even standing contrapposto. Likewise, even though Kauffman dominantly depicted scenes featuring women from classical history or literature, she clearly studied from some sort of portrayal of a nude, whether an ancient statue, plaster cast, partially covered model, or other artist drawings. She was one of the earliest women to exhibit classical scenes in London, and the first artist of any sex to show works depicting British history. A surviving sketchbook has many such examples, a practice to which she alluded in her allegory of drawing, executed as a public ceiling panel for the Academy's council chamber at Somerset House. Analogous opportunities for training extended to many in artistic households. Helena Bietzen, niece and pupil to Catherine Reed, first exhibited genre works in 1772 at the precocious age of 9. 5 years prior, Reed had exhibited this portrait of Bietzen practicing portraiture at only 4 or 5 years of age, enmeshed in her training. Working on 2 large folio volumes propped against each other, she looks up from rendering a female figure. Somewhat remarkably, this seems to have been a marketable subject, as James Watson quickly executed 2 different mezzotint prints after the image. His daughter, Caroline Watson, would soon become engraver to Britain's Queen Charlotte. Clearly, the family model could be profitable. Contemporary accounts reveal that women often painted in the same rooms as their male and female family members, and that the household could function as a fluid commercial space. Here, in a drawing by Marianne Flaxman, we see men and women from the Flaxman, Lowry, Varley, and Mulready families sitting around a table. All except for one of these sitters, Hannah Varley, exhibited their art publicly. In a similar model, both of the sons and at least 4 of the daughters of the academician Philip Reinagel became artists, the daughters educated at home. In 1807, the diarist Joseph Farrington observed, quote, 2 or 3 of old Reinagel's daughters are now copying parts of pictures by old masters lent for this season to the British institution. They work very quick and say picture painted one day, sold the next, money spent the third. Prints after this watercolor identify 2 of the women depicted at the British institution as Fanny and Charlotte Reinagel, alongside artists including Benjamin West. Rolinda Sharple's self-portrait with her mother, the miniaturist Ellen Sharples, epitomizes these dynamics. Rolinda's father and brothers were also portraitists, and Ellen's detailed journal preserves a rare, extensive record of a woman's artistic training as a family enterprise. In her diary, Ellen recalls that she first decided to pursue a professional career and then encouraged her daughter to do so upon witnessing the unpredictable havoc wreaked by the French Revolutionary Wars. Perhaps echoing similar deliberations, British women's activities surged in the late 1790s. Ellen herself practiced miniature painting with new assiduity and encouraged her daughter's ambitions, teaching her at home, acquiring anatomy books, and arranging for lessons with artists like Philip Reinagel while in London. Ellen saw a professional artistic practice as a sort of insurance in a war-torn world. In 1813, she happily reflected, "It's very delightful to me to see Rolinda always cheerful and happy, ardently engaged in various intellectual pursuits, particularly that of painting. Exercising it as a profession she views as attended with every kind of advantage." When Rolinda debuted at the Academy in 1820, 13 years after her mother, she listed 2 addresses, one for her home in Bristol and one where she could be found in London during the show. The situation was different in France, where women dominantly, consistently secured extra-familial training within the traditional studio system. While coming from an artistic family could certainly provide an aspiring painter with valuable lessons and help her navigate the public art world, it was by no means a prerequisite and only applies to a minority of exhibitors, whose proportion decreased over the course of the era. Most influentially, this included 2 highly visible women in the final decades of l'Ancien Régime, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun and Anne Vallée-Coster. Both had artist fathers, both gained Marie Antoinette as a patron, and both joined the Academy at a young age. They've been seen and celebrated as exceptions. But both also pursued the most common educational path for both sexes in France, studying with an artist to who they were not related. The ideal path to success for male artists has long been known. They aim to secure placement in an academician's Louvre studio, then to submit works to the Prix de Rome, and ultimately to gain academic admission, as exemplified by Jacques-Louis David, among many others. This well-trodden trajectory and a corpus of scholarship on David and his studio has led us to understand the French studio system as homogeneously, competitively male. But over this period, more than 100 male artists trained more than 180 women to successfully exhibit their art at the Louvre, the vast majority appearing at the Salon several times. This information has not been hidden. artists regularly listed their teachers in exhibition catalogs, alongside their addresses. Many women even cited more than one male instructor. That the most common path to the salon for French women was to receive training from an established male artist completely restructures the narrative that has been applied to artistic education and to women's opportunities and intellectual pursuits more broadly. Some teachers, such as Pierre-Paul Proudhon, taught only a handful of women who exhibited in these years. Others, including David, trained several dozen. David's steady subversion of gender regulations within the French system through his regular teaching of women parallels a larger history of artistic opportunities that were subtly, increasingly opening. The dominant narratives of studio culture have shown us that David built the premier atelier of his day quite effectively on a foundation of competitive homosocial bonds. But before he took on male students, David gave lessons to Anne Guerret, with whom this talk opened, and her sister Catherine from 1772. They were the first of at least 26 women he instructed through the 1820s, 18 of whom would exhibit publicly, at least one appearing in every salon from 1791 through the 1830s. David next taught two of Vigée Lebrun's pupils while her studio was being renovated in 1786. Marie Benoit, whose painting from the 1802 salon, shown here, was long attributed to David, and her sister. With Vigée Lebrun's dislike for teaching, she doesn't seem to have ever resumed the sister's training. Rather, despite initially framing this tuition as a favor to his peer, David soon flouted institutional pushback to remain their instructor. David wasn't the only artist to teach women in these years, but the French administration doesn't seem to have found this training troubling until 1787. That July, the director of the Arts Administration wrote letters to David and Joseph Benoit Suvet, having ostensibly discovered their tutelage of women by chance and citing a royal decree that prohibited such lessons. For the sake of both morals and integrity, he wrote, women couldn't take lessons in the Louvre unless they were boarding with an artist family, quote, as that would be as if they were your children. Suvet replied immediately, claiming, quote, the greatest astonishment at the letter. He reminded the director that he had seen these students himself when visiting Suvet's atelier the year before, had taken, quote, pleasure in viewing their activity, and had even reported back to the king's sister that a girl she had entrusted to Suvet's instruction was doing well. Suvet taught at least 6 exhibiting female artists. His frustrated note reveals that in the mid-1780s, such teaching had been at least temporarily acknowledged and accepted, even by the head of the Arts Administration himself. David responded the next day, similarly justifying his actions. He claimed that he taught the sisters only provisionally, as a favor, that he supervised them with his wife in a studio detached from his male atelier, quote, with which it is impossible that they communicate, and that their conduct was irreproachable. He invoked a witness to the separate, even prison-like nature of the women's workspace. But despite this rhetorical emphasis on a literal separation of spheres, contemporary accounts describe a more porous divide between teaching spaces. One account refers to Benoit entering the male studio and touching up one of David's own canvases. For David took many of his female students seriously, imparting the skills of a history painter and high-earning portraitist, and even helping them sell their art within the inescapable gender conventions of the era. These 2 contemporary portraits show women practicing from David's own works. One canvas on the left presents a woman painting one of the sisters from the Oath of the Horatii. Similarly, a self-portrait by Benoit shows her copying figures from an early version of David's Belisarius. Perhaps dressed in a painter's smock, Benoit's disregard for her exposed shoulder visually signals her working concentration, her ability to mimic her teacher's style, and her talent at contemporary representation. Her left hand, clasping brushes, exactly replaces the hand of David's young boy. Copying from David's canvases was clearly an accepted form of training, and these women knew they were gaining marketable skills. In fact, when the Parisian Arts Administration chastised David for teaching women, Benoit's father also penned a letter in defense, explaining that recent circumstances, quote, having altered my fortune, I've been pleased to see that my children's disposition for the arts will compensate them well. And it did. Benoit went on to gain Napoleon as a patron, earning thousands of francs for imperial portraits, the same prices as many of her male peers. She was hardly alone. According to David's student Alexandre Lenoir, David guided Benoit's peer, Angélique Monge, closely in mastering, quote, the historic and heroic genre. In 1806, this massive 14-foot canvas, exhibited at the Louvre with its life-size figures, bothered some critics, and yet David mediated its sale to a leading Russian collector for the high sum of 6,000 francs. Monge had studied with David and Jean-Baptiste Regnault, who ran a female atelier from his Louvre salon with his wife, Sophie Meyer. They trained at least 34 women who exhibited from Revolutionary to Restoration Paris. Isolated in their inner Louvre chambers, the atelier kept a strict schedule. According to one pupil, the women practiced portrait and genre painting for 7 to 8 hours per day. These women also seem to have studied from nude models, as attested by several surviving drawings by the painter Paulino Zu. Many were determined in their pursuit of this training. One taught at a girls' school to save enough money to enroll. While the majority of French women obtained training with a male instructor, at least 39 studied with a woman who was not a family member. Some of you may know Adelaide Labille-Guiard's large canvas at the Met, featuring 2 of her 13 exhibiting pupils. Other surviving scenes of female artistic instruction show a more intimate practice. In this canvas, her entry to the 1796 Salon, Marie-Victoire Lemoine purported to provide a window into an everyday art lesson. The teacher holds a mole stick in her right hand, palette in her left. The canvas is partially obscured by the furniture with her painting supplies. A window and back is covered, and the student sits attentively, sketching on blue paper with a porte crayon. This subject's identity remains unknown, but I have found that at least 54 women exhibitors taught or ran studios over the course of their era. From roughly the 1810s, further opportunities emerged for a new generation of women to learn figure drawing, often quite openly and frequently from artists of significant rank. A lithograph by Jean-Henri Marlet from around 1821 shows such a lesson attended by members of both sexes. Male and female students fill the room, interspersed, drawing from a seated male model. This is not presented as a gendered space, and there's no indication that Marlet intended a caricature, or that the women's activity challenged norms of propriety. The accompanying text justified women's presence on the ground of arts itself. It declared, when women engaged in the arts, quote, contemplate a nude model, the art they study extends like a veil between them and any base impression. It added, a large number of women are suited to this work, and it is of little surprise to see a sex that accomplishes nothing without finesse and grace achieve important success in this genre. While this model's midsection remains covered, a lithograph also from the early 1820s makes no such concessions. Here, an older male artist teaches a young woman to draw from an entirely nude man, inspecting her canvas and directing her to look more closely at the standing figure. Turned fully toward her, the model eludes only our prying eyes. This is a caricature, but the object of mockery is the teacher. We see his face lampooned on the back of his student's canvas, and he must stand on a block to see over her shoulder. The caption, "You think that you paint history," is both a taunt and an acknowledgement that the aspiring artist is, by the period standards, on this painterly track. Numerous women exhibited works featuring at least partial nudes, and many more showed historical scenes with life-size figures, several earning Salon awards. Women pursued this training for a variety of reasons, as did men. But in one pattern, by their own testimonies, women in Paris, like Ellen Sharples in Bristol, were motivated by political events. In numerous appeals for governmental aid or commissions, women explained that they turned to art to support their families during the Revolution. In a self-published memoir of 1795, one wrote that she turned to miniature work when she had to become her family's, quote, sole support. Her husband had gone bankrupt in 1789 and had already been imprisoned 3 times. Likewise, in a letter to the Arts Administration in 1807, Pauline de Courcelles requested support for her work as, quote, the war considerably altered her fortunes. A letter bolstering her case explained, this woman artist is the daughter of a captain of the Royal Navy. The death of her father and the Revolution destroyed her mother's fortune. It was through the daughter's talent that they survived. Sharples, de Courcelles, and their peers put financial weight on their visual choices for good reason. Beyond the basic profitability one could gain by cultivating a reputation as an artist, women in both cities often earned comparable figures to those of their male peers, sums that enable them to support themselves, their families, and at times acquire significant wealth. Sophie Frémé was born amid this all in 1797 in Dijon to a heavily Bonapartist family. With the Bourbon Restoration in 1815, they relocated to Brussels, joining a group of expats that included the now exiled David. There, David took on further students, including Frémé and her sister Victorine, seen here. The 2 women studied with David from 1817 until a falling out around 1823. Sophie particularly excelled. She painted copies of David's works for buyers, something Monget had also done, and developed a style that referenced her teacher while claiming her own unique merits, particularly in her attention to detail, brighter palette, and tendency to bathe her portraits in light. You can see the similarities in these 2 works, both painted when Frémé was about 21 years old, on canvases of identical sizes. Mottled Davidian walls, crisp patterns, and muted carpets offset the shimmering, rustling fabrics that announce Frémé's comfort and extreme skill. In 1818, Frémé exhibited the Getty's portrait of a woman at the Brussels Salon. The subject, her name unknown for now, appears dressed for the theater, with a fan in one hand and an opera glass on the table. Lace trims the silky blue dress, its color emphasized and deepened by the complementary orange of her shawl. It shows remarkable confidence for an artist so young and early in her training. I like to think that this confidence reflects Frémé's knowledge of at least some of the women who had come before. Either way, her talent quickly gained notice. In 1820, Frémé was a finalist in a grand prize competition at Ghent Salon with this painting, The Beautiful Anthea. One of David's male pupils reported back, "My dear master, I bow before your sublime lessons, and I admire the beautiful, the graceful Anthea painted by your young student, who is only a woman by her clothing and who is a man by talent." With her near life-size figures and classical setting, Frémé paid tribute to David's classicism, but she distinguished her compositional choices by electing to feature 3 women. Frémé finally did earn a prize for her work, just following her break with David. In 1823, she painted this Death of Centurius, measuring nearly 7 by more than 8 feet. Ever determined, she exhibited it 3 times in 3 years. At the Brussels Salon in 1823, at the Ghent Salon in 1824, and at the Haarlem Salon in 1825. In Ghent, she won a second-class medal, which is said to have been particularly meaningful to her because she had now branched off on her own. Frémé wasn't born into a family of practicing artists, but they were art enthusiasts who became invested in her training. Her father published articles extolling David, for which Frémé acted as a mediator, and her husband from 1821, the sculptor François Rude, benefited from David's introductions. In 1827, Sophie and François relocated to Paris. She exhibited at the Salon that year and soon launched a lengthy career, which included more prizes and running her own atelier. François became a key figure in Romantic sculpture, even modeling his genius of war on the frieze of the Arc de Triomphe on Frémé's features. Here it is next to her own self-portrait from 1841. Fremier, now Sophie Rude, would exhibit at the Paris Salon through 1867, the year of her death. A once storied career. To begin to conclude, I want to pose a question. What makes legacies like those of Fremier and her peers last? When seemingly lost, what makes them recoverable? As many of you know, this talk was originally meant to take place in January, but was rescheduled because of the fires. My own parents were among many who lost their homes. We had all collected objects there, things that mattered to us because of the stories they held and told. I share this in part because I know that everyone here went through a similar experience or is close to someone who did. And although those objects no longer survive, the stories do, through people and community structures. And I've realized that that may be the point. If Fremier, Benoit, Sharples, or any of the artists I've shared with you today had worked in isolation, their stories likely would not survive. We can rebuild their careers and their impact because of the relationships they formed and their public activity, because they put themselves out there against significant odds again and again and again. Despite being sidelined in art histories, these women's legacies are there to find precisely because they were so deeply embedded in their own moments in time. And that offers a lesson I hadn't quite grasped before January. Still, these women lived in a world quite different from our own. To emphasize their fortitude isn't to deny the importance of the gendered exclusions that marked their lives, or their marginalization in the centuries since. Instead, it aims to point to ways numerous women navigated the barriers they faced, often with considerable success. Their embedded legacies do survive, and that requires us to challenge our inherited assumptions about what women could and couldn't do in different places and times. As we increasingly identify their canvases and place them on display, they add new layers of complexity to the art historical project and to women's past experiences. Histories that are messier but much more complete when these elements rest uncomfortably together in our writings, in our conversations, and on museum walls. So thank you. I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you for the enlightening lecture and your research. Having studied art history, I'm sorry to say I have never been exposed to the work that you have shown us today. One measure of value in art is what a painting brings at auction. And I was just wondering if these pieces are now escalating in value. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an incredibly important part of how they're received and how they're collected. One of the reasons that I like to look at numbers and emphasize numbers is because it feels like such an important lesson that in their own places and times, these artists were earning comparable to prices to men. When they were being sold at Salon, when they were being given awards, there's not a huge differential in price. And as you said, that tells us a lot about how they were considered in their own societies. And so the question becomes, what happened, right? When did that price discrepancy emerge? And it did. But in recent decades, you see works by women that gaining increasing value. It often happens after there's a big moment of recognition for their work. There was a Vigée Lebrun exhibition at the Met in, I think, 2016, and her prices skyrocketed after that. But also, one would hope and probably expect that the Getty starting to prioritize someone like Sophie Fremier, her prices will go up as well. And because people associate value with these prices, maybe that then begins to raise their value. But they have been historically incredibly undervalued, at least for the last several decades. It's something I track. And even when one raises up, that doesn't necessarily mean that all artists from this period do. But it's a good time to collect them if you're interested.
Thanks so much for that. That was so interesting and raised so many incredible questions. I have a question that's maybe a little too precise, but I'm sure you can shed light on it. The French revolutionaries established an institute in 1795 to which only men were admitted as artists. They were given free lodging. They were given lots of advantages. But it doesn't seem to have affected women exhibiting in the salons in the following years. So do you have any thoughts about, I mean, it's an interesting issue of they're obviously reviving old patriarchal ideas that men are the ones who should be doing this, and yet it doesn't seem to be affecting the market for or the production of women.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's a really, I mean, it speaks to one of the main questions that I've struggled with since I found these numbers in the first place, is how do you reconcile all of these restrictions and rules that are coming with the French Revolution with the fact that these numbers keep increasing? I've double-checked these numbers so many times to be sure it's what was actually happening. In 1795, you also have laws limiting how many women can assemble in public to, very small groups, and yet you have them being put on display at the salon in much bigger numbers than they're actually limited to. And so I think what's happening is it's this story of rhetoric versus practice. What are women being told they can or can't do, and what are they actually doing? And I think by 1795, there was a long history of both men and women finding ways around all these restrictions for women to study and produce their art. And there being one more didn't make a huge difference when that is something that everyone who was in the art world at that time had a lot of experience with. But it is a surprise. And another question is, in the early 1800s with Napoleon, he notoriously hated women writers, but he actually doesn't seem to have had a problem with women artists. He's commissioning them to create portraits of himself for towns. In 1804, the Salon has an award for the first time. It's the Salon with Napoleon as emperor. And there's one prize for history painting, and it goes to Angélique Monget, and a canvas that no longer survives, as far as we know. But there's a drawing of it in drawings of the Salon from that year. And so kind of this disconnect between what women are doing publicly and what public institutions are in name saying they can't do. I don't have an answer, but I think it's one of the most interesting parts. Yeah.
Can you speak to the socioeconomic background of these female artists? Because I do know that it was looked down upon if you were a bourgeois woman or a titled woman to actually paint and earn money.
Yeah, thank you. Socioeconomic background. So there's one of the reasons I think people haven't looked at these artists per se is because there's been a widespread assumption that if you were an artist and a woman, you were an amateur. And that is actually more of a socioeconomic category than a gender one. And so in either of the countries that I've been talking about, either in Britain or France, if you were of a certain class, it was beneath you to exhibit publicly. It wasn't part of it. You shouldn't sell your art for money. You shouldn't be a professional. And so in Britain, they create this honorary category in the Royal Academy. So if you aren't exhibiting as a professional, if you're not exhibiting to sell, you can exhibit as an honorary exhibitor. And people have assumed that was all women. It's actually more men than women, but it is men and women, and it's about having gained a certain status. In France, that doesn't exist as much. And so with someone like Marie Benoit, who, this is her self-portrait. So after studying with David, exhibiting, getting Napoleon as a patron in the French Restoration government, her husband was given a very high-ranking position. And it was decided that that she could no longer exhibit publicly as a professional artist because that would be at odds with this new status they had. And so she had to stop exhibiting, and this letter survives where it's clear there was an argument. And she talks about this lifetime of hard work she'd put into it and having to give it up for the prejudices of society. And so the socioeconomic, so you're absolutely right that if you have too high of a status, but if you have too low of a status, it's also very hard to come into this. So it's largely a middling class story of women who are passionate about art and work hard to pursue it, but where the monetary value of them doing so is also recognized often by their partners, by their husbands. You have some women who stop exhibiting when they have children and then exhibit again 8 years later because clearly they decided it would help with the family finances. And so it's an important part of the story. Yeah, thank you.
Have you found in your research that on the issue of legacy and historical distortion, are the other artistic counterparts of these painters, architects, composers, writers, subject to similar dynamics that you've described here?
Yeah. That's a wonderful question. There's a lot of people looking for women architects. They have been harder to find. You have a lot of women becoming patrons in architecture, are being involved in smaller levels. I will say in architecture, which I know wasn't the only part of your question, but there's a category of it at the Royal Academy, and there are no women exhibitors. It's one category in which I have not been able to find them engaging. But in terms of the broader structures of finding these women and ways to include them in our narratives, I think women writers were recognized a lot earlier. People know about Jane Austen. People know about George Sand. You have pseudonyms being used by women writers in a way I have not found with women artists, but it's also not something I've been looking for because I'm looking for someone who's exhibiting as a woman, and that's part of their public presentation. But I think throughout kind of the literature on this period, and when you're trying to give recognition to women as a group, you encounter a lot of similar rhetoric, which is that at the time, genius was gendered male, so women couldn't be genius, and there were a few exceptions. And this concept of exceptionality is often used to celebrate women in a really important way. But one of the things I've actually found is that in identifying someone as an exception, you're also saying they're the exception that proved the rule. So it means that most other women couldn't do it. And that I've found to be one of the most powerful parts of the narrative that I actually think has kept us from looking for a lot more that was there. Because by celebrating rarity, which is part of our celebration of, artistic genius, of artistic brilliance, it makes it harder to look for groups and kind of for these wide waves, big waves of activity. But you do have a lot of people looking and finding ways to access what women did or contributed or ways they were valued. When I've talked to scholars of other fields, who are looking at Fanny Mendelssohn or, Clara Schumann, we share so many frustrations in the ways that their work has been handled and in the way, kind of the obstacles that we face in trying to assert their importance. And so I don't think it's necessarily discipline specific, but the material is very different in different forms of creative activity.
Paris, I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to select one that has come in on the Zoom, if you don't mind. Do you know how most of the connections between a male instructor and female student might have been initiated?
It's a great question. So that's how did women find these male instructors? Often it was through I think there was a combination of word of mouth and family connection. You know, you knew someone who worked with them. Sometimes there's groups of sisters or cousins who actually aren't all working with the same artist. You would think they would, but they all have different teachers, and so you wonder what is happening there. But there's not a lot of evidence for how that happens, I think in part because even though the instruction was advertised in the catalogs, the means to it were at least less documented. And so it's not something I've found other than the rare occasion of a family friend, or I think sometimes you have these anecdotes of someone meeting in exhibition spaces, but those are rare. So I wish it's an area that I hope someone takes up.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Maybe everyone can join me in applauding Paris for a really wonderful talk. And also the galleries are still open, and if you want to go and have a look at Sophie Fremier's painting, it's on view in the paintings galleries on the second floor of the South Pavilion.